Hello and welcome to English for Philosophy students. Today we are in lesson number 50 of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. We are in rule number 7, and this is the third lesson of rule number 7. This is a very philosophical chapter in the book, difficult conceptually. And so I want to begin by reviewing the argument that Jordan Peterson is making so far. The rule says that we should choose what is meaningful rather than what is expedient. He begins by reiterating the idea that life is suffering. Life sucks. Everybody suffers and everybody dies, and it is apparently meaningless. And as a result, people become nihilists and decide that the only thing that matters is to have pleasure and to enjoy life, even at the expense of beating up old people and stealing their money, or injuring the vulnerable. So at the experience of what we know to be moral living. Then Jordan says that it may be true that to pursue pleasure is expedient, but it is not meaningful. And he holds out the question, is it possible that there is something more meaningful that we could choose to go for? Then he goes in and begins to speak from his perspective as an evolutionary biologist. In former chapters of this book, Jordan Peterson suggested that human beings have evolved from very simple life forms all the way up through to the intellectual level that we are today, and that we have some degree of memory built into our system from times when we were less than human. And you can imagine an animal today. An animal will eat all the food that is presented. An animal does not usually think, oh, I should share some with those less fortunate. An animal does not think, oh, I should save some for the winter, usually. Animals basically act on instinct, and they don't really seem to have much of a conception of time. They live in the present, more so than human beings. And Jordan Peterson was suggesting that we human beings were like that before we developed to the point that we are today. And that there came a time when human beings began to wake up to the idea that there was future and that they might be able to do something right now that would make their future better. And Jordan says that we human beings at our current level of development, we have an idea of what the meaningful thing would be, but it's sort of in our gut, in our emotions, in our instincts, rather than in our brains, we haven't fully developed and articulated our moral theology, our understanding of what behavior is meaningful and valuable in an ultimate sense, compared to what behavior is expedient in a short-term gratification sense. He says that when human beings first, back in prehistory, began to awaken to the idea of some meaningful action, the first thing we did was begin to embody it in art and literature and also ritual. And even to this day, in our great dramas and great narrative stories, we can see heroic action. But if you were to try to write a treatise on what actions are meaningful and superior, the behavior of heroes often wouldn't look very good. They do crazy things. So we still don't fully understand, and we cannot fully articulate what actions have eternal meaning and eternal value, as opposed to short-term value. But we recognize it when we see it. We recognize heroism. So at the point where humanity, according to Jordan, was beginning to awaken to this realm of thought, one of the very first things that happened was we began to sacrifice things to God. In the Bible, in Genesis, we have the stories in the first 3 chapters of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in paradise, and they are living in a timeless present, which is joyful and secure. It has no fear of the future, no regret of the past. It is a little bit like an animal existence in some ways. Then the fall of man happens. Man eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, symbolically awakening to some understanding that certain actions are more valuable than others. And then they're cast out of paradise, and the very first thing that comes up after this expulsion from paradise is the story of the sacrifice of Cain and Abel. And Jordan Peterson says that, and this is the very end of last lesson, Jordan Peterson says that the act of sacrificing was a little bit like bargaining with God. You say, I will give you this if you will bless me in the future. So, this ritual of sacrifice was a way for mankind to embody this understanding that creation, the universe, is set up such that things you do now can change the future. By the way, I am having a problem with my iPad. It's not charging well, so I hope we can make it through this lesson. Okay, now, I want to read the end of the segment that we studied last week so that we can move straight into this week. Okay, so I'm beginning with the section called the delay of gratification. I'm just going to read and then we will plunge into the new section. The delay of gratification. When engaging in sacrifice, our forefathers began to act out what would be considered a proposition if it were stated in words, that something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. So that is the proposition that sacrifice suggests. Recall, if you will, that the necessity for work is one of the curses placed by God upon Adam and his descendants in consequence of original sin. Adam's waking to the fundamental constraints of his being, his vulnerability, his eventual death, is equivalent to his discovery of the future. The future, that's where you go to die. Hopefully not too soon. Your demise might be staved off through work, through the sacrifice of the now to gain benefit later. It is for this reason, among others, no doubt, that the concept of sacrifice is introduced in the biblical chapter immediately following the drama of the fall. There is little difference between sacrifice and work. They are also both uniquely human. Sometimes animals act as if they are working, but they are really only following the dictates of their nature. Beavers build dams. They do so because they are beavers, and beavers build dams. They don't think, yeah, but I'd rather be on a beach in Mexico with my girlfriend while they're doing it. Prosaically, such sacrifice, work, is delay of gratification. But that's a very mundane phrase to describe something of such profound significance. The discovery that gratification could be delayed was simultaneously the discovery of time, and with it, causality, at least the causal force of voluntary human action. Long ago, in the dim mists of time, we began to realize that reality was structured as if it could be bargained with. We learned that behaving properly now, in the present, regulating our impulses, considering the plight of others, could bring rewards in the future, in a time and place that did not yet exist. We began to inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people and our future selves. Doing so was indistinguishable from organizing society. The discovery of the causal relationship between our efforts today and the quality of tomorrow motivated the social contract, the organization that enables today's work to be stored reliably, mostly in the form of promises from others. Now we're going to begin the new section. Hold on. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to read on. Understanding is often acted out before it can be articulated, just as a child acts out what it means to be mother or father before being able to give spoken account of what those roles mean. The act of making a ritual sacrifice to God was an early and sophisticated enactment of the idea of the usefulness of delay. There is a long conceptual journey between merely feasting hungrily and learning to set aside some extra meat smoked by the fire for the end of the day or for someone who isn't present. It takes a long time to learn to keep anything later for yourself or to share it with someone else. And those are very much the same thing, as in the former case you are sharing with your future self. It is much easier and far more likely to selfishly and immediately wolf down everything in sight. There are similar long journeys between every leap in sophistication with regard to delay and its conceptualization. Short-term sharing, storing away for the future, representation of that storage in the form of records, and later in the form of currency, and ultimately the saving of money in a bank or other social institution. Some conceptualizations had to serve as intermediaries, or the full range of our practices and ideas surrounding sacrifice and work, and their representation could never have emerged. Okay, so let's go through this again. He is talking about the conceptual development of the idea that I can do something now in order to change the future. And this was a very basic idea at first, but it became more sophisticated by stages. And it evolved into our understanding that work produces good results in the future, and it is quantified in money. So let's read again. Okay, understanding is often acted out before it can be articulated. So he was saying at the time earlier that something like an animal woke up to the idea that maybe I could make a bargain with God and give something in order for God to bless me later. This understanding was very foggy. It was not clear. And therefore, the early human being in Jordan's conception began with a ritual sacrifice so that they could act out this idea without thinking it through too carefully. They just offer the sacrifice and hope for the blessing. Later, we were able to articulate that so much work equals so much money, which can purchase so many goods in this kind of a quantified way. That's very sophisticated. But early on, it was just, I will sacrifice my produce for the gods so that they will give me a good harvest later. So, acted out before it is articulated, which means understood clearly. That actually means spoken, literally, but here he means clearly understood. So, just as a child acts out what it means to be a mother and father before he could ever explain what the role of a father and mother is. So you see children just playing mommy and daddy. So he is saying the early ritual sacrifices were like children playing mommy and daddy before they really understand what's going on. The act of making a ritual sacrifice to God was an early, in the mists of time, and sophisticated enactment of the idea of the usefulness of delay. Okay, so those early sacrifices of early man were an enactment, means kind of like almost like a demonstration or a play where you ritualize something and see it, of the idea of the usefulness of delay. So delay of gratification. There is a long conceptual journey, meaning there is a gap in evolution of the type of being who could just begin to conceptualize the idea that something I could do now might make the future better. Even just the understanding that there's future is one step. And then the idea that I could do something to change it is like 2 steps. I can do something and it will change it. That is causality. So there's steps and breakthroughs and great ideas, a long conceptual journey between merely feasting hungrily, so that's the animal who eats everything, between that and learning to set aside, save some extra meat smoked by the fire. That would be another conceptual step, how to change it so that it will last. Smoked by the fire for the end of the day, like that I could eat at the end of the day, or for someone else who isn't present. It takes a long time to learn to keep anything later for yourself or to share it with someone else. And those are the same thing as in the former case, meaning the first one, to keep it for yourself. You are sharing with your future self. It is much easier and far more likely to selfishly and immediately wolf down everything in sight. Wolf down means eat violently and quickly. Ha, 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 ha. That's what wolf down means. It's easier and more likely, meaning an unevolved creature would do this. It's more difficult, and you must be more highly evolved to save for someone else or for your future self. So it's easier and more likely to wolf down everything in sight. There are similar long journeys. So a long journey is a long conceptual journey. Long conceptual journey here. From the unevolved behavior to the more sophisticated behavior. There are similar long journeys between every leap in sophistication with regard to delay and its conceptualization. Okay, so I think he means by long journeys, sort of long periods of time evolutionarily. He's saying that this behavior of delaying your gratification is a very advanced behavior, and it takes time to evolve into a creature capable of it. So he's saying there are similar long journeys between every leap in sophistication with regard to delay and its conceptualization. So delay means don't eat it now, save it for later. Its conceptualization is, how do I think about this? How am I understanding my behavior? Am I not eating because I am full? And then in 2 hours I wake up and I'm hungry again, so I eat? That would be a low level of conceptualization of delay. A higher level would be, I would like to eat this now. I am not full, but I want to save it for later. That would be higher, a higher level of conceptualization of my behavior of delaying eating. Even higher might be, I will give the first portion to God and burn it so that he will bless me later. That is even a higher conceptualization. Okay. Short-term sharing, storing away for the future, representation of that storage in the form of records and later in the form of currency, and ultimately the saving of money in a bank or other social institution. Okay, so all of these are leaps in sophistication. Each of these are steps in the evolution of our understanding of our behavior of saving for the future. Okay? Short-term sharing, so I save a little bit of meat for my partner later. Storing away for the future, I smoke the meat and save it for the future. Representation of that storage in the form of records. So I have stored meat, put it away, and it's written down so I can go and take that back. Or I have contributed this meat, therefore I am entitled to so much corn or so much milk or something. And then finally, currency and banks. All of these are levels of development in our way of quantifying our delay of gratification. Some conceptualizations had to serve as intermediaries, or the full range of our practices and ideas surrounding sacrifice and work and their representation could never have emerged. So he is saying the way we behave now with respect to work and sacrifice is so complex and sophisticated that there really had to be these levels of development, or else we'd never be here today. Personally, I don't believe this. Personally, I am not an evolutionary biologist. I think God created man, and man had all these capacities when he was created. But this is Jordan Peterson's way of taking it apart and understanding the philosophical development of meaning. Okay, so let's move on. And I'm going to get a new color. I'll use blue. Our ancestors acted out a drama, a fiction. They personified the force that governs fate as a spirit that can be bargained with, traded with, as if it were another human being. And the amazing thing was, it worked. So Jordan is saying now that the idea of God was our ancestors who were emerging into full humanity. They personified, they anthropomorphized, they made out that there was a spirit that was like man that they could bargain with, a creator spirit or a governing spirit. And he says, remarkably, it worked. Personally, I say there really is a God, there really is a spirit, and you really can communicate with him. And that's why it works. But we are following Jordan Peterson's logic, okay, and thought. So, our ancestors acted out a drama, a fiction, meaning it's not true. They personified the force that governs fate as a spirit that can be bargained with, traded with, as if it were another human being. And the amazing thing is, it worked. This was in part because the future is largely composed of other human beings, often precisely those who have watched and evaluated and appraised the teeniest details of your past behavior. So he is saying that mankind erroneously, meaning it was an error, it was wrong, but for some reason they thought that the being that governs fate, which Jordan Peterson does not name, he suggests there may be a being that governs fate. He doesn't say yes or no to that, but he's saying the ancestors incorrectly thought that the being that governs fate is like a human and will have the same responses a human would. And if I do good things in the present, he will reward me in the future, the way humans do. And then Jordan says, this worked. This brought good results, not because there really is a spirit that is like a human, but because the future is full of people who have been watching your behavior and are ready to reward you if you do what they like. So there may not be a God in the future, but there is a boss, an employer, who will give you money if you have worked well for him. He is someone who has been watching your behavior and is standing there to reward you according to your behavior. So he says these people are in the future. They're in the present too. And they have watched and evaluated our behavior. And Jordan Peterson says this situation is not very far from that to God, sitting above on high, tracking your every move and writing it down for further reference in a big book. So he is saying that this idea that some spirit is watching us and writing down our good behavior and our bad behavior is actually sort of similar to the fact that an employer is watching us and writing down our good behavior and our bad behavior. He is saying that the idea of a God really just comes from this very natural human interaction. We have attributed to God the behaviors we see in other humans. Here's a productive symbolic idea. The future is a judgmental father. So he says, here's a productive symbolic idea. All of what he's talking about is symbolic ideas. Sacrifice is a symbol for delay of gratification and work. God is the symbol of the good results that come from good behaviors. So a symbolic idea is God is, the future is, meaning God, a judgmental father. A father who is watching you all the time. Father is benevolent, but judgmental means he is really watching your behavior. That's a good start, but two additional archetypal foundational questions arose. So he is suggesting that this was how mankind's consciousness developed. So he says, two other ideas arose, they came about, they evolved. Two other ideas arose because of the discovery of sacrifice, of work. He is saying sacrifice and work are the same. When we discovered sacrifice and work, two more ideas came up. Both of these ideas have to do with the ultimate extension of the logic of work. So the logic of work is I do something now which will enhance the future. And there are apparently two questions to be considered with respect to this. And the logic of work is sacrifice now to gain later. Okay, move on. Let's get a new color. Let's go with green. Okay, so two questions about the logic of work. First question, what must be sacrificed? Small sacrifices may be sufficient to solve small, singular problems. Singular means only one, simple problems. But it is possible that larger, more comprehensive sacrifices might solve an array of large and complex problems, all at the same time. So an array means lots of large, complex problems, all at the same time means simultaneously. One big sacrifice solves a bunch of big, complex problems. Maybe. That's harder, but it might be better. Remember, he is talking about choosing what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Expedient is the easy thing that gives you lots of gratification. Meaningful, he is going to build an understanding of what that is. It's valuable in an eternal sense. So something harder might be better. Adapting to the necessary discipline of medical school, for example, will fatally interfere with the licentious lifestyle of a hardcore undergraduate party animal. So, if I make a huge sacrifice, maybe that will solve lots of problems. Well, maybe I'll go to medical school, which is 8 years of huge amounts of work, long hours, no rest, lots of money, costs money. It's difficult. It's costly. But, of course, it'll solve all your problems for the rest of your life. But what he's saying here, it is going to fatally interfere with your licentious lifestyle of an undergraduate party animal. So if you're in medical school, you can't party it up in your college years. So that's a big sacrifice. Giving it up is a big sacrifice. But a physician, a doctor, can, to paraphrase George W. Bush, former president of the United States, a physician can really put food on for his family. So in other words, a physician makes a lot of money and can provide well for his family. That's a lot of trouble dispensed with over a very long period of time. So dispensed with means solved. So that's a lot of trouble solved for the rest of your life, just if you sacrifice those 8 years. So, sacrifices are necessary to improve the future, and larger sacrifices can be better. So, the first question with respect to the logic of work is what must be sacrificed, large and small. Let's get the second question. We'll do a new color. We'll try blue. Second question. Set of related questions, really. So the second question is more than one question. We've already established the basic principle. Sacrifice will improve the future. So that's the basic principle. Sacrifice will improve the future. But a principle, once established, has to be fleshed out. So a principle is good, but we need some explanation, some examples, some parameters. Okay, it has to be fleshed out. Its full extension or significance has to be understood. So if it's only a principle, that's not enough. What is implied by the idea that sacrifice will improve the future in the most extreme and final of cases? When I read this, I thought, the most extreme and final. If you give your life for God, like you are a martyr, then you go to heaven, and that solves all your problems eternally. So it occurred to me when I read, what is implied by the idea that sacrifice will improve the future in the most extreme and final of cases? I thought, death as a martyr, heaven. Where does that basic, where does that basic principle find its limits? We must ask to begin, what would be the largest, most effective, most pleasing of all possible sacrifices? Now, you know, in the Old Testament, bad people used to sacrifice their children to the god his name was Moloch. And to a mother, to sacrifice her child would be the most. To some people, perhaps sacrificing themselves would be the most. Okay, what would be the largest sacrifice? And then we must ask, how good might the best possible future be if the most effective sacrifice could be made? So these are the questions, related questions, all part of question number 2. Basically, question number 2 is, how big is the biggest sacrifice we could make, and how good is the outcome? So that's question number 2. Now he goes into the biblical story of Cain and Abel. So I will read. The biblical story of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's sons, immediately follows the story of the expulsion from paradise, as previously mentioned. Cain and Abel are really the first humans, since their parents were made directly by God and not born in the standard manner. Cain and Abel live in history, not in Eden. They weren't born in Eden. They must work. Work is part of history. It's part of our lives. They must work. They must make sacrifices to please God. And they do so with altar and proper ritual. But things get complicated. Abel's offerings please God, but Cain's do not. Abel is rewarded many times over, and Cain is not. It's not precisely clear why, although the text strongly hints that Cain's heart is not in it. Maybe the quality of what Cain put forward was low. Maybe his spirit was begrudging. Or maybe God was vexed for some secret reasons of his own. And all of this is realistic, including the text's vagueness of explanation. Not all sacrifices are of equal quality. Furthermore, it often appears that sacrifices of apparently high quality are not rewarded with a better future, and it's not clear why. Why isn't God happy? What would have to change to make him so? Those are difficult questions, and everyone asks them all the time, even if they don't notice. So, the story of Cain and Abel is a story that Jordan Peterson feels or believes and is saying the story matches the way the world really is. The story symbolically works out and studies and explicates a truth about the way the world works. Some sacrifices bring reward, some sacrifices don't bring reward. It's not always clear why. It is not clear how to make God happy. It is not clear whether God was unhappy because of the quality of the sacrifice or the quality of the person making the sacrifice. Jordan is saying that this is a great symbolic story showing the evolution of our understanding of meaning, of the value, eternal value of certain actions. Asking such questions, that means asking questions like this, is indistinguishable from thinking. Okay, so asking such questions as this, why did God not accept my sacrifice? Is just thinking. It's thinking, what have I done wrong? Indistinguishable. You can't tell the difference between asking these questions and simply thinking. The realization that pleasure could be usefully forestalled dawned on us with great difficulty. So again, he's saying the animal, the subhuman, who was struggling to evolve into a greater understanding of philosophical meaning, this animal had a lot of difficulty breaking through to understand what kinds of actions bring good results in the future, what kinds of sacrifices please God symbolically. So, the realization that pleasure could be usefully forestalled, that means delay gratification of your pleasures, delay enjoyment, and get something valuable. It is useful to delay. Forestalled means delay. This idea came with great difficulty. It was hard. And in this story, Cain is so angry he kills his brother Abel and then is himself banished. Symbolically, this shows the struggle between humans who haven't figured out what actions are meaningful and humans who have. And the lower human kills the higher human, symbolically. So the realization, dawned past tense on us, meaning in this really old time before history, before mankind was really human. These ideas were just beginning to come to us. So the realization that pleasure could be usefully forestalled dawned on us with great difficulty. It runs absolutely contrary to our ancient, fundamental animal instincts, which demand immediate satisfaction, particularly under conditions of deprivation, which are both inevitable and commonplace. So, the idea of sacrifice is the opposite of what the subhuman animal would ever do. Animals don't sacrifice, supposedly. Subhumans, every instinct was to consume for self. And especially if there's famine or deprivation, you want to keep it all for yourself and fight the others. And conditions of deprivation are inevitable and commonplace. Inevitable means every single person will experience them, for sure. You can't get away from them. And commonplace means you experience them all the time, a lot, not just once in your lifetime. So under these bad conditions, our animal instinct is all against sacrifice. So that's why it was so hard for the idea of the value of sacrifice to come to us. We had to break through evolutionarily. And to complicate the matter, such delay only becomes useful when civilization has stabilized itself enough to guarantee the existence of the delayed reward in the future. So these primordial subhumans might make a sacrifice and then the meat just spoils because nobody smokes it and preserves it. The first ones who made the sacrifice didn't have a civilization stable enough to preserve the fruit of their labor or the sacrificed substance. So then there would be no reward. So how do you ever evolve into believing that sacrifice brings reward, since early sacrifices wouldn't bring reward? We need all those intermediary steps. It seems to me this makes it hard to really believe in Jordan's idea of the evolution of philosophy here. But whatever. Okay, so if everything you save will be destroyed or worse, stolen, then there's no point in saving. You have to have a stable civilization to preserve what you are saving. It is for this reason that a wolf will down 20 pounds of raw meat in a single meal. That means he will eat. To down it is to eat it. 20 pounds of raw meat in a single meal. He isn't thinking, man, I hate it when I binge. I should save some of this for next week. No. So how was it that those two impossible and necessarily simultaneous accomplishments, delay and the stabilization of society into the future, could possibly have manifested themselves? We're going to have to end there because we're out of time. But the question is, how did it ever happen that primordial subhuman man ever broke through and evolved into the true understanding that delay of gratification brings a greater reward? Since, first of all, it's against all his instincts. And secondly, if he does save any, it'll just spoil. He's not going to really glean anything because there's no civilization. The only way you have the civilization is if everybody comes to the understanding that they need to cooperate and delay gratification and save and share all at once. How did it happen? That is a question for the next lesson. See you then.